The desert had a way of killing slow heat like a hammer, silence like a coffin lid. He'd ridden 3 days on a dry throat and a tired horse when the cry split the canyon. It wasn't the wind. It was a woman's scream. Asterisk, the desert was a cruel judge. It didn't care for names or pasts. It stripped a man to nothing but grit and bone. The land itself seemed forged out of fire-red mesas standing tall like watchmen. The sky stretched endless and pitiless, and the sun beating down until a man's skin cracked like old leather. It was in this merciless country that the drifter rode, his Mustang stumbling under him, ribs showing with every ragged breath. He had no map, no destination, and no promise of water ahead. Just dust in his teeth and the nagging whisper of memory. Folks back east might have called him a wanderer, but out here, men like him were simply ghosts on horseback seen one day, gone the next. He carried little more than a Winchester in a saddle scabbard, a Colt that hadn't been fired in weeks, and a pocket Bible worn so thin the words were nearly rubbed away. The drifter wasn't young anymore, but the years had hardened him instead of breaking him. Lines carved deep around his eyes spoke of squinting into too many horizons, waiting for something worth finding. His hat brim sagged with sweat, the dust of half a dozen counties clinging to the crown. He rode like a man who'd forgotten what comfort was, but still couldn't let go of the trail. That trail had led him deep into Apache country, though he hadn't set out to trespass. Boundaries in this land were written not on maps but in blood, and more than one white man had vanished for riding where he didn't belong. Still, the desert didn't ask permission, and neither did thirst. If there was water in these canyons, he meant to find it, even if it meant risking arrows in the dark dot by noon. Heat waves shimmered off the baked earth, turning the horizon into a wavering dream. The Mustang's head drooped low, and the drifter leaned forward, whispering, "Easy, boy." Just a little further. His voice was rough as gravel, lips cracked, tongue dry. He knew horses quit quicker than men when the water ran out, and if his mount dropped, so would he. The desert had a way of reminding a man how small he really was. Every cactus, every thorn bush seemed to mock his struggle, alive in a place where few things could live. Buzzards wheeled overhead, black specks against the sun, patient as undertakers. He tried not to look at them. It was then, through the stillness, that sound reached him faint but sharp, carried on the canyon wind. Not the call of a coyote, nor the croak of a raven. This was higher, urgent. A human cry. The drifter stiffened in the saddle, listening hard. The Mustang twitched its ears. Again it came, thin but clear a scream, echoing off the stone walls. A woman's scream. His first instinct was caution. Trouble had a way of dressing itself in all kinds of disguises out here. But there was no mistaking the sound of pain, the kind that tore out of a throat against its will. He tugged the reins, steering the Mustang toward the canyon mouth, rifle hand resting loose at his side. The scream came once more, then cut off sudden, swallowed by silence. The hair on the back of his neck bristled. Whatever waited ahead, it was something alive and maybe dying. The drifter leaned low in the saddle, whispering again to the Mustang. The horse, though weary, obeyed. Together they pressed into the canyon, shadows stretching long across the stone floor. Each step echoed like a drumbeat, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a woman's life was hanging by a thread. And for reasons he couldn't name, not yet the drifter felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. The desert had been his only companion for years. But that scream told him he was no longer alone. The canyon walls closed in as he rode, the light shrinking to a narrow ribbon above. Shadows clung to the stone, cool against the heat, but the air carried no mercy. The Mustang's hooves struck against loose rock, the sound sharp and lonely, like gunshots bouncing down the passage. Then he heard it again, fainter now, but desperate. A cry, broken and hoarse. He dismounted, boots crunching on the gravel. "Stay here, boy," he muttered, patting the Mustang's neck. The horse snorted, ears twitching uneasily. The drifter loosened the Winchester from its scabbard and followed the sound on foot, careful, cautious, his eyes sweeping the canyon for movement. What he found made his chest tighten. At the bend, a sorrel mari lay twisted on the ground, sides heaving shallowly. Its back legs were tangled in a tumble of loose rock, blood pooling dark beneath its flank. And trapped beneath that same weight was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 20, her braids streaked with dust, her dress torn at the sleeve. An Apache. Her arm was pinned under the horse's saddle, and every breath she drew came sharp and ragged. Eyes shot to him as he appeared, wide and fierce even through the pain. She tried to push herself free, but the rock and horseflesh held her fast. A rattlesnake slid across the stone nearby, scales whispering against the canyon floor. Another coiled not 10 feet away, tongue tasting the air. The drifter froze for half a heartbeat, measuring the scene. He'd seen enough snake bites in his time to know one strike here would finish her. And she couldn't move. Slow as Sunday, he raised the Winchester to his shoulder. The barrel tracked the rattler nearest her, its coils tightening. He fired. The blast cracked through the canyon, scattering dust from the ledges above. The snake jerked, head shattered, body writhing in death throes. The woman flinched at the shot but did not cry out. Her gaze snapped back to him, wary, untrusting, but alive. The second snake hissed, sliding closer. He chambered another round, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The echo rolled down the canyon like thunder, and the snake's body fell limp, tail buzzing weakly before it stilled. Smoke drifted from the Winchester's barrel. Now the real work began. He slung the rifle, hurried forward, and crouched by the woman. Her breathing was shallow, her lips tight with pain. "Easy," he said, voice low as if speaking to a spooked horse. "I ain't here to hurt you." She stared at him, defiant despite her helplessness. One hand free, she clutched a knife, the blade trembling in her grip. He raised his palms, showing them empty. "All right," he murmured. "You keep that handy. But if we don't shift this horse, neither of us is walking out of here." Her eyes flicked from him to the weight across her body. A hesitation, then the faintest nod. He set his shoulder against the horse's saddle and heaved. The animal groaned weakly, legs twitching, but the rock slide had it pinned near as bad as the woman. The drifter strained until his muscles burned, but the weight barely shifted. Damn. He stepped back, chest heaving, sweat streaking down his brow. He scanned the slope above loose boulders, branches caught in the rocks. If he could pry some free, maybe. He found a branch thick as his forearm, wedged it beneath the saddle, and leaned with all his weight. The lever creaked, then the horse rolled just enough to give. Now. He barked, grabbing her under the shoulders. She cried out but pushed with what strength she had. Inch by inch, he pulled her free, dragging her clear of the rocks and into the open dust. The mare collapsed fully then, sides shuddering one last time before stilling. The canyon grew quiet again, except for the harsh sound of her breathing and his own. He laid her down gently, checking her arm. Bruised, bloodied, but not broken. He tore a strip from his shirt sleeve and bound the worst of the cuts. She winced, but her knife hand never wavered, still clenched tight against him. "You'll live," he said, meeting her gaze. For a long moment, she said nothing. Only the heat shimmered between them, her dark eyes locked on his weathered face. Finally, she lowered the knife. Not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. The drifter sat back on his heels, feeling the desert press in again around them. He didn't know yet what trouble he'd invited by saving her, but he knew one thing for certain. Her scream had tied their fates together. The woman lay still for a moment, chest rising shallow, sweat streaking the dust on her face. The drifter crouched beside her, listening for the cadence of her breath, checking the way her eyes fluttered half shut. She wasn't out of the fight, not yet. But she was close to being spent. He slid a hand under her shoulders. "Come on," he murmured. "We can't stay here. The sun'll cook us both." Her gaze snapped open, sharp again, and the knife flashed back into view. Weak as she was, she still carried herself like a hawk with talons out. The drifter couldn't help but respect that. "All right," he said, his voice low, steady. "You want to keep that blade at my throat. You do it. But let me move you, or we're both rattlesnake food before nightfall." Her jaw clenched, but her hand faltered. At last she slipped the knife back into the leather sheath tied at her hip. It wasn't surrender. It was trust bought on credit he'd have to pay back. The drifter lifted her, careful as he could, and carried her toward the sliver of shade that clung to the canyon wall. She was light, but her weight pressed into him with the heat of fever, her breath warm against his neck. He lowered her onto a patch of cool stone and pulled his canteen from his belt. It rattled nearly empty. He tilted it toward her lips. "Just a swallow." No more. She drank greedily at first, then caught herself swallowing slow. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked back to him. For the first time, he saw something softer than defiance in them. Something like recognition. "Good," he said, pulling the canteen back. "That'll keep you steady." He glanced at her arm. The cloth binding he'd tied was already red with blood. He pulled his knife, tore another strip from his shirt, and wound it tighter. She hissed through her teeth but didn't cry out. Her strength surprised him. He'd seen grown men collapse from lesser wounds. When he was done, he sat back against the canyon wall, wiping sweat from his brow. The desert stretched silent beyond, its heat pressing down like a hand on his skull. The woman's gaze lingered on him. Then she spoke, voice hoarse, the words carrying the cadence of her people's tongue. He didn't catch all of it, but one word repeated clear enough: "Thank you." The drifter nodded once, solemn. He wasn't the kind of man who saved lives for gratitude. He wasn't even sure why he'd ridden toward the scream instead of away. But here she was, alive because he'd meddled. "Rest," he said simply. "I'll keep watch." He rose, rifle in hand, and scanned the canyon mouth. The feeling of eyes on him prickled at his neck. Apache country was no place for a white man to linger, not without invitation. By sundown, her people would be searching. If they found him standing over her with blood on her arm and 2 dead rattlers nearby, well, no amount of truth-telling would spare him. Still, he stayed. Hours dragged under the weight of the sun. He fetched what little shade he could with his hat brim, checked her pulse when she stirred, and shared another mouthful of water when her lips cracked. She grew restless, muttering in her language, eyes darting even in dreams. He wished he knew enough words to calm her, but silence was the only gift he had. Toward evening, she woke clearer, her breathing steadier. She looked at him long, studying every scar on his weathered face, every twitch of his jaw. At last she spoke again, softer this time, and pointed east toward the rising line of smoke in the sky. A signal fire. Her people were coming. The drifter tightened his grip on the Winchester. He wasn't afraid of a fight. He'd seen enough to know fear didn't do a man any good. But he wasn't blind either. A lone gun hand against a hunting party? That was suicide. Still, when she looked at him again, there was no fear in her eyes. Only certainty. She was alive because of him. And that bond, whatever it meant in Apache law, was about to drag him into a reckoning he hadn't asked for. He exhaled slow, setting the rifle across his knees. "All right then," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Guess we'll face your people together." The desert wind carried the faint sound of hoofbeats, growing louder, and the drifter, for the first time in years, felt the weight of another soul tied to his own. The hoofbeats grew louder. bouncing between the canyon walls until they filled the air like distant thunder. The drifter stayed seated against the stone, rifle across his lap, the wounded woman resting only a few feet away. He didn't move. Movement might look like fear, and fear was blood in the water. The first riders appeared at the bend, dark hair streaming, ponies sure-footed over the rocks, faces painted in ochre and black. Arrows were knocked before the horses even stopped, bowstrings taut. The woman stirred, lifting herself on one elbow. She called out in her tongue, words sharp, commanding. The warriors reined in, but their arrows didn't lower. The drifter could feel the weight of their eyes on him, half a dozen men, lean and hard, every one of them measuring whether he was worth killing. He shifted his rifle just enough to rest it on the ground, palms open, showing he had no plan to raise it. One rider, older than the rest, pushed forward. His hair was streaked with gray eagle feathers bound at his crown. His gaze cut to the woman first, and only then to the drifter. He barked a question short, harsh. The woman answered, her voice stronger than he expected. She gestured toward the fallen mare, then toward the blood on her arm, and finally to the two dead rattlesnakes. Her words came quick, insistent, like water rushing over stone. The chief, or whoever he was, listened, face carved of iron. When she finished, he turned his gaze back to the drifter. Silence stretched long. Then he spoke in English, rough but clear. "You," his voice carried no warmth. "Why are you here?" The drifter rose slow, careful not to spook them. "Heard her cry," he said simply. His words carried flat across the canyon, stripped of excuse. "Pulled her out from under that horse. That's all." One of the younger braves snarled something, spurring his pony a step forward. His arrow aimed dead at the drifter's chest. The woman barked another command, fierce as a hawk. The young man hesitated, then eased back, bow still taut. The chief dismounted, boots crunching on the gravel. He came close enough that the drifter could smell the dust and horse sweat on his clothes. His eyes searched the drifter's face as though looking for cracks, some sign of a lie. "You kill snakes," the chief said at last, motioning to the corpses on the stone. "You save her life," the drifter gave a single nod. "That's the truth." The chief turned then, addressing his people in their tongue. The woman's name surfaced in the words, sharp and clear. The braves shifted uneasily, some lowering their bows, others not. At last the old man raised his hand, silencing them. He looked back at the drifter, his face unreadable. "Among my people," he said slowly, "a life saved is a bond. A woman saved is a wife given." The word struck harder than a bullet. The drifter's mouth went dry. He opened it, shut it again, searching for something to say. The woman looked at him, her eyes steady. She did not smile. She did not flinch. She only watched him, as though testing what kind of man fate had tied to her. The drifter cleared his throat. "I didn't." He stopped, realizing there was no way to argue without insulting the law that held him at their mercy. He swallowed. "I only did what was right." The chief's gaze hardened. "Then you will do what remains right." He gestured to the woman, then to the campfires smoking in the east. "You come with us. You are husband now." The younger braves murmured, some in anger, some in mockery. The drifter felt their eyes burning holes in his back. Outsider, trespasser, interloper, and yet, bound by their own law, untouchable, at least for now. The woman, still pale from her wounds, pushed herself fully upright. She spoke, voice clear though her arm trembled. Whatever she said made the braves fall silent. She climbed unsteadily onto one of the ponies offered her and glanced down at him. Not a question, not a plea, just expectation. The drifter looked at his Mustang, worn and tired, then back at her. For the first time in years, the trail wasn't his own to choose. He swung into the saddle, rifle strapped across his back. The warriors wheeled their ponies and rode east, the chief at the head, the rescued woman near the center. The drifter fell in behind, dust rising around him as the canyon swallowed the sun and shadows deepened. He knew one truth. He'd stepped into a storm far bigger than himself. And this time, he couldn't ride away. The ride east took the better part of the evening, dust rising under the pony's hooves, the setting sun painting the desert in blood-red light. The drifter kept his Mustang at the rear, watchful, silent. Every so often, a younger warrior would glance back at him, eyes full of challenge, as if daring him to falter. He d-idea in single quotes t-dot. By the time they reached the Apache village, dusk had settled into the folds of the mountains. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the smell of mesquite and roasting meat. Children darted between the brush shelters, dogs barking in alarm at the rider's return. Women emerged from the shadows, their eyes searching, their voices lifting in sharp cries when they saw the wounded woman. They rushed to her, guiding her from the saddle with careful hands. She brushed them aside with as much dignity as her battered arm allowed, standing on her own. She spoke fast, gesturing back toward the canyon, toward the stranger who sat stiff-backed on his Mustang. Just beyond the circle of firelight, the villagers turned their gaze on him as one. Some faces held suspicion, others outright hate. He felt their eyes like knives against his skin. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching against hard-packed earth. He didn't reach for his gun. He knew better. The chief stepped forward, his feathered crown stark against the firelight. He raised his hand, and silence fell over the camp. The only sounds were the crackle of flames and the low murmur of horses stamping in the dust. The woman spoke again, her voice clear despite exhaustion. She told her story, her words rolling fast in the Apache tongue. The drifter couldn't understand the language, but he caught pieces in the rhythm of it. The cry, the horse, the rattlesnakes, the gunfire, the lifting of the weight. Every so often her hand pointed toward him, and he stood straighter under the fire of so many eyes. When she finished, the camp erupted in voices. Some shouted for his death. He could hear it in the heat of their tone, see it in the way they clutched their weapons. Others argued back, gesturing at the woman, their words heavy with respect for her survival. The chief let it rage for a time before lifting his hand again. His eyes were steady, hard as stone. He spoke in English this time, his words meant for the drifter as much as for his people. "This man," he said, "saved the life of my daughter." The drifter blinked. Daughter. That truth landed heavy, explaining the iron weight of every gaze, the fury of the young braves, the sternness in the old man's face. "In our law," the chief continued, his voice carrying like thunder over the campfire, "when a man saves a woman from death, his spirit is tied to hers. He is her protector, her husband." The drifter felt the words settle on him like a yoke. His first instinct was to deny it, to explain that he hadn't come seeking a wife or a home, that he was just a passing hand with no place to lay down roots. But one look at the circle of faces told him denial would mean nothing. To refuse would insult their law, and that would end with a noose around his neck or an arrow in his chest. The woman met his gaze across the fire. Her expression gave nothing away. No plea, no regret. Only acceptance, fierce and unyielding, as though she had already decided the bond was carved in stone. The chief stepped closer, his eyes boring into the drifter's. "Do you accept the law of my people?" The drifter drew a slow breath, the desert wind burning dry in his lungs. He thought of the trail behind him, empty, endless, and lonely. He thought of the scream in the canyon, of her eyes sharp as a hawk's even while trapped and bleeding. Fate, it seemed, had made its choice for him. "I accept," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. The camp erupted again, some with cheers, some with curses. The younger warriors spat into the dust, their anger hot. But the chief raised his hand once more, silencing all. "Then it is done," he declared. By nightfall, he is husband to Nalin, daughter of the chief. The drifter's jaw tightened. Nalin. At last, he had her name. The chief turned away, leaving the crowd to disperse. Women led Nalin into a lodge to tend her wounds. Warriors lingered, glaring at the stranger, but none dared move against him now. The drifter stood alone at the edge of the firelight, the Mustang tethered behind him, the weight of a life he had never chosen pressing down like the desert sun. He had saved her life. And now, by the law of her people, his own life was no longer his own. The Apache village moved with its own rhythm, steady, ordered, like a river flowing around stone. And the drifter was that stone. The morning after the judgment, he woke to the sound of drums in the distance, the camp already alive. Women tended the fires, children raced between lodges, dogs barked and snapped at their heels. Warriors prepared bows, spears, and rifles for the day's hunt, glancing his way with eyes that carried both suspicion and scorn. He sat on his haunches by the edge of the camp, rolling a cigarette with fingers that felt clumsy. He could feel their stares even without looking. He was an outsider, branded not by scar or mark, but by the weight of a law he hadn't chosen. Nalin, he repeated her name in his head. The only piece of her he could claim as his own was seated across the fire, her arm bound with clean strips of cloth, her dark hair braided tight once more. She looked better, though pale. She hadn't spoken to him since the night before, but she hadn't avoided him either. That, he figured, was something. When he finished rolling, he struck a match and lit the cigarette. A group of younger braves, no older than 20, laughed sharp at the sight, their words like knives. He didn't need to know the language to catch the meaning. Coward, trespasser, thief. He blew smoke slow, steady, showing nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence was its own kind of weapon. Still, his hand itched for the Colt at his hip. But he wasn't foolish. A single pull of that iron would see him dead before the hammer fell. By midday, the chief summoned him. The old man stood tall at the center of camp, his feathers catching the sun. Nalin was at his side, her chin raised, proud despite her injury. Around them gathered nearly the whole tribe, a circle of hard faces and sharper eyes. "You are husband now," the chief said. "But words are not enough. A husband works. A husband protects. You will show us you are not weak," the drifter nodded once. Fair enough, and so they gave him tasks. First, hauling water from the stream, the women watching, whispering behind their hands. Then, mending a corral post while the young brave smirked at his awkwardness. Later, helping skin a deer brought back from the hunt, the knife heavy in his hand as he worked under the eyes of men who wanted nothing more than to see him fail. He didn't complain. He didn't falter. He just worked, his silence a wall they couldn't climb. When the sun dipped low, he sat alone outside a lodge, rubbing calluses into already calloused hands. Nalin approached, moving with the quiet grace of someone who had lived her whole life on this land. She carried a bowl of stew corn, venison, beans. She set it down in front of him without a word. He looked up at her. For the first time, her eyes softened, just a fraction. She didn't sit, didn't smile, but she stayed long enough to make sure he ate. He lifted the bowl, nodded his thanks, and drank deep. The stew was hot, rich with smoke. It burned his tongue, but it was the first real food he'd tasted in days. When he set the bowl aside, she was already gone. That night, he lay on a bed of furs inside a lodge, the fire crackling low. Nalin slept across from him, her breathing even, her face turned away. He stared at the ceiling, smoke curling against the hides, and thought about the road he'd left behind. He had never wanted ties, never wanted roots. Yet here he was, bound by law and honor, husband to a woman whose trust he hadn't yet earned. The camp outside grew quiet. Dogs barked once, then settled. The desert wind whispered through the brush. The drifter closed his eyes, but sleep came slow. He knew tomorrow would bring new tests. He knew the young braves would circle him like wolves, waiting for weakness. And he knew one truth above all. He could no longer live only for himself. He was tied now to Nalan, to this tribe, to a law older than his own people's. And though his heart resisted, some small part of him wondered if maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a curse, but a chance. The days that followed bled together, each one heavier than the last. The drifter worked where he was told, hauling wood, hauling water, mending what needed mending. The tribe gave him food, a place to sleep, and little else. He took it without complaint, though every glance told him he didn't belong. The women tolerated him, whispering behind their hands but letting him pass. The children watched him with wide eyes, darting away if he so much as nodded their way. But the young braves, Nalan's age or younger, never let him forget he was an outsider. It started small. A shove when he bent for a water bucket. A word spit in his direction, sharp with mockery. A horse untied, sent wandering before dawn. He ignored it at first. He'd lived long enough to know tempers cool faster when a man gives no heat back. But some fires don't want to die. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the campfires crackled, the young braves gathered near the corral, their voices rising in laughter. The drifter was on his knees repairing a saddle strap when a shadow fell across him. He looked up slow. It was one of them, a tall, lean warrior with scars across his cheek, a bow slung over his shoulder. His eyes burned like hot coals. The others circled close behind him, their grins sharp. "You," the scarred one said, his English broken but clear. "Husband," he spat the word like it was poison. "You are weak." The drifter rose, dusting his hands on his pants. He said nothing. The warrior stepped closer, chest out, chin high. "Nalan, chief's daughter. Too strong for you. Too proud. You are nothing." He jabbed a finger hard into the drifter's chest. The circle of braves tightened. The drifter felt the eyes of half the camp drifting toward them. Women pausing in their work, elders watching from the shadows. He took a slow breath. His instinct told him to walk away. But something else, the weight of Nalan's eyes, the weight of the tribe's law told him he couldn't. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice low. The warrior sneered. He motioned toward the open space beyond the corral, where the ground was hard and flat. "Show strength. Fight or leave." The challenge hung in the air. The young men grinned wider, hungry for the spectacle. The older ones said nothing, but the fire in their eyes told him this was no small test. The drifter's jaw tightened. He looked at Nalan, standing near her father's lodge, her face unreadable in the fading light. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But her gaze was locked on him. He sighed through his nose. "All right," he said. "If that's what it takes." They stepped into the circle. The braves shouted, stamping their feet, the dust rising thick. The scarred warrior stripped off his shirt, muscles corded and lean. He held no weapon. This was fists and grit. The drifter rolled his shoulders, feeling the years in his bones. He hadn't fought bare-knuckled in a long time. But the rhythm never left a man, not once it was beaten into him. The warrior lunged first, swinging wide. The drifter ducked, drove a fist into his ribs. The young man grunted, staggered, then came back with a flurry. One caught the drifter's jaw, snapping his head to the side. Pain bloomed hot, but he steadied, planted his boots in the dust. They circled, blows trading, the crowd roaring louder with each strike. The warrior's youth gave him speed, but the drifter's years gave him patience. He waited, letting the young man burn himself out, each swing wilder than the last. Then, when the opening came, The drifter stepped in, hooked an arm, and drove him hard into the ground. The breath shot out of the warrior's lungs in a single gasp. The crowd went silent. Dust settled. The drifter stood over him, chest heaving, but he didn't strike again. He stepped back, giving the man room to rise. Slowly, the warrior staggered to his feet. His pride burned hotter than his bruises. For a heartbeat, it looked like he might lunge again. But then his gaze flicked to the circle, to the chief's lodge, to Nalin. He spat blood into the dust and stalked away. The braves muttered, some angry, some grudgingly impressed. The drifter wiped his mouth, tasting copper. He looked once more at Nalin. This time, her eyes softened, just enough to let him know she'd seen what he'd done. The test wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, the tribe saw him not just as an intruder. They saw him as a man who could stand, and the drifter, bruised and aching, realized that maybe, just maybe, he belonged in this fight after all. The desert was quiet that night. Too quiet. The drifter sat by the lodge fire, nursing a bruised jaw and split knuckles from the fight with the scarred warrior. His body ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from surviving. Around the camp, the tribe had settled into its evening rhythm. Children herded into the lodges, warriors sharpening blades by firelight, women singing low as they worked hides. Nalin sat across from him, her wounded arm bound tight, her gaze fixed on the flames. She hadn't spoken to him since the fight, but there was something different in her silence, now less distant, less cold. He couldn't name it, but he felt it. Then came the first sound, a distant crack like dry wood splitting. Too sharp, too sudden. The dog sprang up, barking furiously. Shadows stirred at the edge of the camp. The drifter's hand went to his Winchester before he even thought about it. He rose, scanning the darkness. The elders shouted warnings. The braves grabbed bows and rifles. Then the raiders came. They poured out of the desert like a swarm of locusts-painted men on stolen horses, rifles flashing in the firelight. Not Apache, not cavalry. Outlaws. Renegades who preyed on whoever was weakest in the moment. Tonight, they'd chosen wrong. Gunfire split the night. Arrows hissed through the air. Screams rose as the raiders stormed into the camp, tearing through lodges, scattering women and children. The drifter didn't think. He moved. He swung the Winchester to his shoulder and fired. The first outlaw toppled from his horse before he hit the edge of the firelight. Another charged close, pistol drawn, and the drifter dropped him with a shot to the chest. He worked the lever smooth, the old rhythm of war sliding back into his bones. But there were too many. For every raider that fell, two more broke into the camp. The braves fought hard, their war cries cutting through the smoke, but the raiders were ruthless, firing wild, striking at anything that moved. The drifter turned. Searching for Nalin, he found her near the chief's lodge, helping women gather the children into the shadows. A rider broke from the chaos, charging straight at her with a raised blade. The drifter's heart seized. He ran. He fired once, the shot ripping the rider from the saddle. The horse thundered past, nearly trampling Nalin, but she stood her ground. The drifter reached her, grabbing her uninjured arm. "Get back!" He shouted. She shook her head, eyes blazing. "No, I stay." And she did, knife flashing in her good hand, standing over the children as if she were made of stone. The drifter had no time to argue. Another raider came screaming through the smoke, and the fight swallowed him whole. The battle raged long into the night. The drifter fought beside the Apache warriors, shoulder to shoulder, firing until the Winchester ran dry. Then, drawing his Colt, he struck with fists when bullets ran out, every bone screaming. Blood slick on his hands. At last, the tide broke. The raiders, their numbers thinned, scattered into the desert. A final war cry rose from the Apache braves as they chased the stragglers into the dark. The camp was left smoking, broken but standing. The drifter staggered, chest heaving, sweat and blood streaking his face. He lowered his Colt and looked around. The wounded were gathered, the fires tended, the dead covered with blankets, and Nalin still stood. Her braid had come loose, her face streaked with soot, her arm trembling with exhaustion, but she was alive. Her eyes found his across the wreckage. For a long moment, they only looked at one another. In her gaze he saw something new, not just recognition, not just respect, but a bond that went deeper. A bond forged not by law, not by judgment, but by battle and survival. The chief approached, his face grave but proud. He placed a hand on the drifter's shoulder. "You fought with us. You bled with us. Now you are one of us." The words sank in heavier than any bullet. For the first time in years, the drifter felt the weight of belonging. He looked back at Nalin. She gave the faintest nod, a gesture small but sure. Not a stranger now. Not an outsider. Husband. Partner. Protector. The desert wind blew soft through the camp, carrying the smoke of battle into the endless night, and the drifter knew the trail was no longer his alone.